Welcome to another museum FAQ video. I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator of POW, Paul Orselli Workshop, here on Long Island. But my background is actually the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, which you'll see how that fits into the mix here with our special guest, Meera Jagroop. I'm very happy to see you. How are you today, Meera?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
I'm good. Even better to see you. So, well, I always like to start out by having our guests talk a little bit about their background, because I think it's always interesting, the twists and turns people's backgrounds take. So, Meera, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background, and then we will launch into the main part of the conversation.
Sounds great. So thank you for inviting me to do this video. And it's nice to see folks, even if it's virtually, that I haven't seen in a long time. So my name is Meera Jagroop, and I currently work at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden as the manager of family programs and the Discovery Garden. And so the Discovery Garden is a 1-acre hands-on gardens for kids and families. And as you can imagine, it's been closed since March, but we just reopened the garden a couple weeks ago. So I've had a chance to be in the Discovery Garden recently, which has been so nice. And I've been working at BBG since 2012, I think. So it's been a really long time working there. I started as a children's garden instructor, teaching kids about growing food. And then was there for a little bit, and then worked at the Brooklyn Children's Museum as a science educator, and then found my way back to BBG when the Discovery Garden opened. I live in Brooklyn. I grew up in Queens and also on Long Island in Baldwin, which is where Paul lives as well. And I met Paul at Bank Street. He was my professor in our exhibit design course, which was really special because exhibit design became like one of the things I was really excited about, and ultimately was the reason I got involved with the Discovery Garden project, because it was just like a big dirt patch at the time, 5 years ago. So I got to be a part of the exhibit design process, even prototyping exhibits and ideas for planting, signage, programs, and it was so exciting to be a part of the development of a new children's garden. It's such a big institution. I feel like it's not so often that big places are opening such new big exhibits, and also just developing programs just from scratch with all of the great feedback and things like that we were able to get from families of what they wanted to see in space. So yeah, that's I would say that's what I'm like really excited about doing. I love being outside, I love plants, I love working with kids. I love teaching adults of all ages, backgrounds, and abilities.
Well, that's great. Even though, of course, all the students I was fortunate to teach at Bank Street in the museum education program, there are always some students who stand out, who seem like, "Wait, this is a person to keep an eye on because they're really gonna go places in this business." And that certainly was you, and that is you with the great work that you're doing. So that's a perfect segue, I think, and your description of your background, I think, is a perfect segue to really talk a little bit today about how to engage people of all ages, adults, school groups, family groups, children, with nature. And maybe you can share, some of the things that you've learned, both in a positive sense, just ways to engage people, but also maybe some stories or things that you found out like, this seems to be a common thing with certain groups or certain groups of people that maybe make them a little shy of nature or a little apprehensive even. It's funny, you mentioned, of course, we're filming this, during the pandemic era, as they say. But nature continues. It's not like even though people couldn't go into the garden or into museums, the garden keeps growing and the flowers keep growing, and they have to be maintained, of course. So anyway, if you could start us out, Meera, and really talk about some things that strike you as ways to engage people with nature.
Sure. I feel like I should start by saying that I was not always a nature person. And I would have never guessed that I would end up working outdoors and teaching people about plants and animals and the natural world. So growing up in Queens, it wasn't, a very lush place botanically. But my family's from the Caribbean, and they are super connected to the nature there. And so coming to Brooklyn, where they were originally were living for a long time, and then Queens, they weren't super familiar or comfortable, with plant life or the outdoors there. So kind of, going outside, doing nature play and things like that were not big parts of my childhood. We go across the street to this patch of grass to run around, and that was it. And it was really nice. And I made kind of like a strange impulsive decision to go to SUNY Environmental Science and Forestry for college. I originally went there starting as a biotech major, hoping to, somehow go into like a lab or medical job. And I just kind of wanted to go somewhere that wasn't New York City. That was kind of, I live so close to the city that I think everyone was kind of expecting me to go to school there. I was like, I want to go somewhere different. Like, I'm going to go to the country, which I thought Syracuse, New York was the country. It is not, but
well,
to me,
compared to Queens,
compared to Queens, it was the country for me. So it was definitely a really eye-opening experience. I went on my first hike when I was 18 into the woods with my class. I forget what class it was. I think it was like some like basic flowering plants or something like that, just IDing things. And I had the worst time. It was like my first or second week of college, and all the other students that were there, grew up spending time in nature, like woods nature and forests and marshes and things like that, and really knew what the right clothing and shoes to wear and what plants they should avoid and which ones they should, like how to push, even the little things like how to push a tree branch out of the way properly so you don't like poked in the eye. I realized I was really allergic to a lot of bugs, and I showed up to this hike wearing like fashion sneakers and like shorts, and I just had a really terrible time and had to really reconsider like what I was doing here.
Well, but that puts you in the perfect spot now.
Yeah.
I'm sure you are working with lots of people who maybe their only real exposure to nature is at the Botanic Garden. So I mean, it's funny to hear you describe it, but actually you may well be the perfect person to help urban people make the connection to nature.
Right. So it's so true. I think that at the time I was like 18 and didn't know how that was going to inform my work at this point in my life. But I decided to stick it out. I made such like wonderful friends there, and I did love, nature and plants and animals and things, and I loved learning about them. I didn't feel like I was learning about them in a really accessible way. ESF has such knowledgeable professors who are like professional scientists, but they're not necessarily like teaching in a way that might be accessible to somebody who's never been on a hike before.
Yeah, they might not have been trained as science communicators.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Except for a few. I have to say one professor who really changed my life and kind of made me feel like I need to stay in this field was Dr. Robin Kimmerer, who I feel very lucky that she was my professor, not only in the classroom, but in the field. I took a field course at Cranberry Lake, and we just walked around in the woods, and she was really focused on traditional ecological knowledge, and how like the whole ecosystem's connected and how we're connected to them, and how all that stuff can be scientific too. I feel like I had a different idea of what science and nature was, like memorizing Latin names, working in the lab, and just doing like really, really important, but kind of like intense research. So after experiencing her course and seeing how she would teach, that's when I realized, like, oh man, I like really like her approach, and found that that's an approach they often take in informal science education, which is kind of how I ended up doing what I do now. And I will say, like, that I think to like get buy-in, from not just families, but whoever wants to experience nature or teach nature, especially if they've ever had the experience before, they have to feel like they can do it. Like they have to also know that like nature exploration can just be like looking at the plants that are growing out of the crack of the sidewalk too. It's not just being in the woods. And I'm lucky to have had someone like kind of early in my life to help me realize that. If not, I could have definitely had that like first or second experience and thought like, this is not for me, I'm never doing this again. That really, I think, informs my work. Like when people come to the Discovery Garden, I really want kids and adults to get excited about plants, realize like plants are amazing, not all the same. I know when I was a kid, I knew like every single animal and every single dinosaur, but plants were like, that's a shrub, that's a flower, that's grass, that's a leaf. And it's exciting when kids come to the DG because they can realize that there's so much more than that in the plant world. And then also feeling like they can come back and like do that exploration on their own, even, without a teacher or a caregiver there. And then all those other little things that were shocking to me when I went on my first hike. I think the Discovery Garden is designed in a way, these parts aren't open right now, but hopefully they will be soon, where the paths are pretty narrow and winding so that the plants can grow into and over you. So you feel kind of enclosed in the space and you feel the plants touching you as you're walking. Those were all intentional parts of the design, which I think, there's not many places you can go like that unless you have a car or something, unless you can like leave the city. And also it has miniature habitats, so you can experience like a woodland, a meadow, and a marsh, and a fruit and vegetable garden, and a sensory garden, all in a 1 acre area. Yeah. It's very lucky that we have all that space, and even if you can't make it to the garden, you could still do nature exploration too. I just think, just the biggest thing for me is that like, nature exploration can happen anywhere as long as you're outside.
So just to unpack two things that you said. One is a comment. It's interesting what you said about sort of people's perception of animals versus plants, like kids knowing, like knowing all the dinosaurs or knowing about animals, and plants are just sort of there. Like we realize trees and grass and flowers, but you might not know a lot about them, not specific names or things. So that I think is interesting. But just to hone in on what you said about how to make people comfortable, how to sort of get them engaged, even after they leave or come back to the garden again after they've seen you or some of your fellow educators, how to get them enthused about the botanical world, not just the animal world. So maybe can you share some ways that you think about, you're engaging with adults, you're engaging with class groups or children. What are some ways that you can get people more engaged? Like what are some tips or techniques that you might share for the ways when you're working with people at the garden or just in nature in general that you think would be helpful to get people, I'm going to say more excited and more willing to be explorers, and less sort of like, oh, these are either I'm kind of freaked out, or those are just plants.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think oh man, depends on so many things, especially the age, of the kid. But I would say if it's an adult or a kid who's a little bit older, I'd love to find out what they're excited about. Even if they're not excited about plants, like maybe there's a food that they're excited about, or an insect they're excited about, or a TV show where it reminds them of something from their favorite show or video game, which has happened with kids. Like see something that reminds them of like something that's not really like explicitly related to plants, and try to connect with that. I think food is a really big one, which is food and medicine and just plants that are useful. So, we have so many fruits and vegetables growing. We have sometimes growing like cotton and like other things that are used for textiles. Also having a variety. So this is not something we're able to do all the time, but in the past we've done a Caribbean plants garden. BBG is located right next to Crown Heights. I'm also really biased that my family's Caribbean, so I always want to see things like sugarcane and callaloo growing in the DG. So it's usually pretty, I feel like usually families and kids will tell me what they're interested in before I even have to ask. And that's usually my entry point. Going in with like an extremely set plan of how I want the experience to go, I think most educators in any field knows that,
that's a recipe for disaster.
Exactly.
I'm gonna keep pounding this information into you until it's much. I think that's a great, that in and of itself is a great starting point. Like, know your audience, go where they are interested in, and if they're interested in video games, hey, there are mushrooms in Super Mario, or there whatever. You can, if you're thoughtful educator, you can find the connections if you want to. So that's a great point.
Someone might really not like being outside. They may be really uncomfortable. They want to get dirt on their clothes. They don't want, and that's fine. Like, but maybe they love cooking and they love eating pizza. So like, let's go look at the basil. Like, let's like crush up a basil leaf and taste it and smell it. It's interesting. There are, folks that are like kind of hesitant to eat the same plants they would buy at the grocery store, like from the actual garden, and opposite experience. They're super excited, and it does take a little like of like setting an example, like doing it yourself, to show that it's okay, and all the steps, and like really making people feel comfortable, that this is something that they're doing on their own, because it might be something like so new to them, or maybe they're a botanist, and they need a totally different experience. I would say for younger kids, again, this is kind of like across the board with all, science, history, art, all that stuff. Sensory stuff is just so great. So smelling, tasting, touching, like listening to plants. I mean, plants do make noise, and we do a lot of like nature play. So we'll do potion making, but the actual process of potion making is crushing up a bunch of herbs in a bowl with water, and they can experiment with how much water and herbs they want, and they just stir it, and they'll do it for like an hour, which is a really long time for a 2-year-old or 3-year-old to do an activity. Playing with soil, using plant materials for other things like paintbrushes, or just like incorporating them into nature play, like making costumes, having a nature play tea party. We'll take a lot of like plants that we've cut back, like even stuff that we're about to compost, and make little like dinner plates out of wood tree cookies, and add a couple stuffed animals. And it's such a great time seeing, it's like you're doing like stuff that you would almost do at home, but instead of using a paintbrush that you buy at a store or like a plastic toy, you're just using plant material. I know that, for some folks, they see that and they're like, okay, they're just playing. But I also kind of think that there's like so much other learning happening at the same time. Even science learning, that will continue to grow. And I think, especially our biggest audience is the youngest kids. Having kids have those experiences really early, and for adults to see the materials that we use and be like, oh, I can do that. Like I can find some of that like leaves, you know, myself, and we can do this at home. Is so exciting to hear. Like when I hear caregivers and parents say that, I'm just like, yeah, you totally could do this at home, and I hope that you do.
Well, and I think, I think it's I think it's a mistake for people to just sort of downplay play, to say, oh, that's just play. Because if you can find these connections, and it might be, wow, here's a tree cookie, or here's a branch, we can use that like a fork and a plate, and we're going to make potions and stir things up. Those are really foundational activities and foundational memories for young children, so that they have a positive attitude towards nature. I think that's really important. And also what you just said about adult caregivers or teachers or scout leaders, again, oh, I can't help my kids engage with nature. We live in the city, or I'm not a scientist, or that. For them to see some of the playful and engaging ways that you work with children or school groups or what have you. And then, yeah, exactly what you said. Oh, I could do that with my scout group. I could do that with my class. I could do that with my kids at home. That I think is really a way to expand your work well beyond the boundaries of the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. And that it just keeps spreading, because then, oh, their neighbor sees their kids playing with that, or they're having a play date. Oh, I could do that at my house too. So that's awesome. Well, I'm wondering if there are maybe any stories. It's always interesting to me. One way we can get at, I think, science education or arts and cultural education is to help people sort of get over their misconceptions about things like nature and plants. So I don't know if there are any instances, or if you, from the many, many people that you've worked with over your career so far, if there are certain things that might keep popping up that are sort of like, oh, people just have this idea about plants, and I don't know where they get this idea about plants, but that this is a way that we can help them think about plants or nature in a more positive or a more useful way. So I don't know if that springs anything to mind.
Yeah, I would say, the biggest thing I hear in the Discovery Garden is when people come to the DG, they expect to do gardening. And I mean, has the word garden in the name, I would expect the same. They want to water, they want to plant something, they want to, they want to weed, they want to learn about, they think about edible plants. And we have a very small fruit and vegetable area, and we also can have up to 33,000 people just in the DG a year. So we don't have the space for everyone to be able to do that. Because we've heard that as like a desire for visitors, we did create a Discover Gardening program where we've like kind of designed it in a way that like, we can have up to 200 kids at a program. So we, everybody gets a little slice of kohlrabi or carrot, or you plant one seed. We went and went to see what other botanic gardens are doing and got a lot of really good ideas about how to facilitate that. So while it's not like a super deep experience, we're kind of like the toe dip experience. And then hopefully if they do want a deeper experience, they can sign up for an actual program, or either at BBG or somewhere else. I also found that, we had a lot of signage in the DG that was very beautiful and, printed with text, and no one was reading them. And it had like a, not that no one was reading them, but it's a kid's space. And if you're a caregiver and you're looking at your kid's taken off running down this really fun windy path or jumping on rocks or stumps or anything, you're not going to have time to stop and look at the sign. So what we start, and the sign is really written, I would say, to empower the caregivers to it's not for the kids to read necessarily, but it's written kid-friendly language so the caregivers could feel empowered to explain a science topic to the kid. So I should back up and say that I would say the Discovery Garden, we really wanted to show visitors it was more than just gardening. Like the world of botany is about science, and you know, how does pollination happen? Where do turtles go in the wintertime? How do carnivorous plants work? All those, I mean, I could just
Yeah.
go on.
Well,
You know?
it's the broad picture of nature, not just here's an oak tree, but you know, birds and squirrels live in that oak tree also, for example.
Exactly. There's one sign that actually says squirrels are gardeners. Like that's the title of the, and it goes into it. So there's just so many different nature topics that I wouldn't have never even thought of, or like I think about and wonder, like if I were to see it, like those like spiky little sweet gum things I've been kicking around since I was a kid. Never thought about what those were until I was like an adult. So I think what we've done that has been successful for us is, and this was like a total experiment. We started writing handwritten signs, like a black sign with like chalkboard. Like I use a paint pen, but it looks like a chalkboard. And people love them. They stop and they read them. They're small enough that they have a small amount of text. It looks like somebody's talking to you. And at first I started by just putting like, smell this flower, smell this plant on it. And then when I realized people were reading them, I started putting like some science facts on there, some nature facts. And even I've just been able to go back into the Discovery Garden after not being there for a really long time. And a lot of the interactive exhibits are closed temporarily. And so I've been adding even more of those signs in to kind of create like just things for caregivers to read, you know, about certain topics. And it's amazing. I'll put one out and no exaggeration, like 1 or 2 minutes later, a visitor is like reading it to their kid.
Well,
And
I just think that I think that's a really great idea and a great takeaway that you just gave there. I mean, this idea of a handwritten sign does exactly what you said it does. You know, it doesn't feel like this formal printed botanic garden museum sign. Like, oh, a real person, like a human being touched this, you know, and it's obviously from what you described more approachable. And then you can leverage that approach as an educator to build the prompts, to build the, you know, the observational tools or the science pieces of science information and interpretation into that. So I think that's a great idea. You know, I often say sometimes the easiest way to fix an exhibit is to change the label. So that's like a real way of changing the label to make it much more approachable to people, and to obviously they attend to it. So I think that's a great idea.
biggest challenges, oh, sorry. One of the biggest challenges about creating signage for a garden, especially pre-printed signage, is like things will bloom for a week and then they're done. Or things will just start growing and you're like, that's cool, you know, and it wasn't supposed to be growing there. Or, you know, for example, when the garden was closed, a ton of vegetables started growing in the compost, and our dig zone is a full-on beautiful floral meadow right now. And it's been take more work, and I'm, you know, I feel like BBG is really like, you know, they have the resources and time and dedication. You know, it's part of my job to just create those signs. It's like a big part of it. But I can, you know, make a sign immediately, put it out for something that's blooming, and then take it away a week or 2 weeks later when that thing is gone.
Well, I think that's the other thing that's important about that sort of handwritten signage approach, is that you can use it on the fly. You know, if there's something blooming for 1 week or something that's happening, you know, you move the sign to where it's happening and you help people focus on that. And then it goes away, or you just erase the sign and change it to something else. So I like that. I like that approach very much.
I would say one other thing that I like to do, which again could be, I don't know if it's controversial, but maybe not everyone would agree, is I definitely take really scientific information and boil it down to as simple as possible. That way, you know, maybe not I can't do that with every plant topic and everything I'm trying to talk about, but even just pollination, you know, or like, what is a pollinator? I recently made a sign that said, you know, a pollinator moves pollen from one flower to another, and it helps make more plants. That is like the simplest explanation ever. I think could make a lot of, you know, folks with a science background cringe, like that's not what's actually happening or whatever. But I think for like some other folks who do not feel like experts in the topic and still want to teach their kids stuff, they'll take one look at that sign. I actually saw this happen like on Tuesday. Looked at the sign and then brought their kid over to a flower to teach them about not even like where the sign was. Like they said the word, the text from the sign pointed at a different flower. And that was just such a cool thing. I was like, wow, look at this. Like, I'm not even involved here. Like, there's an adult who saw that, felt really excited about it, and really wanted to share that with their kid on their own.
Well, you're making the topic more accessible and having the adult caregiver feel like now they can be the teacher. I mean, in a way, you provided a little script for the adult caregivers. I mean, they could literally have almost read out loud what you said in a conversational way to their kid, and then started that engagement, like you said. So I think that's also a powerful way. And forget about those people, you know, oh, this isn't the technical way, you know, there's a lot more to pollination. The thing is, our job as educators in botanic gardens, museums, cultural organizations, outdoor organizations, whatever, you know, we're not there to merely provide information. People have the internet, they have a phone in their hands. If they want a plant ID, or they want the Latin binomial, or they want 15 paragraphs about pollination, they can get that. Our job's not just information. It's interpretation. It's helping people bridge the information. And if they want more, get a book, look at the library, come back and think again about what that. So I forget about those people. You're doing the right thing. You're as your professional peer and former professor, I say you're doing the right thing. Keep it up. So anyway, well, Meera, I don't know if there are any last inspirational words or stories about how to get people to engage with nature that you might like to share in closing here. And then I had, before we wrap up, after you might share another idea or two about sharing nature with people, I'm gonna have a request of you. So, but before we get to that, so we build the anticipation in this video. I don't know if you have any last words or ideas about, or tips about helping people to become more familiar and enjoy nature.
Right. Oh man, I don't know if I have any like concise tips, except that just, you know, plants are everywhere. Like, engaging with plants you don't need to be a scientist, you don't need to go into the woods. It could just be you engaging with your house plant, or going to the park and feeling the grass and smelling things, and sharing that with other people, whether it's a kid or your friends or things like that. I think especially now people are looking towards the outdoors as their new oasis, when there are other indoor spaces or other, you know, places we usually go to relax or have fun are closed. So I would say, yeah, like plants are just really amazing, and I encourage people to like take small risks and kind of push themselves out of their comfort zone, and find other people to experience nature with.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, that's a great way to end this. And I'll say, as they always say in YouTube land, we will include references and links to the things we've discussed. And before we start recording, Meera mentioned a recent blog post that she did related to this topic, so that I will include all those things so people can have additional jumping off points about how to help themselves or their children or scouts or whatever enjoy nature. So now, Meera, I'm gonna ask a request of you, And that is to hold up your forearm there so we can see one of your amazing nature-related tattoos. That one, oh, look at that. So here's look at that. Here's this person who was afraid of insects or allergic to insects, and now they have all these awesome nature-related tattoos. So I'll tell you, you obviously are you're serious about your connection to nature, because if you put a tattoo on yourself, that's awesome. Well,
people always ask me what came first, like the botanic garden job or the tattoos. I was like, well, I have a lot of like botanically inaccurate plant tattoos that I had before BBG, and now they're botanically accurate.
Well, the learning always continues, and you can say, hey, you know, look, I've got a pollinator right there on my forearm. So that's great. Well, Meera, always a great pleasure to see you and hear about you and your work. I'll tell you, if there's anything that makes me feel positive about the future of museum work and informal education, it's people like you. So I'm so happy you took the time to speak with us today, and all the best to you helping people learn about plants and nature at the Botanic Garden.
Thank you, Paul.
Take care.
Bye.